Orson Welles changed everything. When we talk about modern landmark films, we say that Jaws was the first modern blockbuster. We say that Star Wars changed special effects. We say that Jurassic Park changed computer animation, or at least popularized it. Things like that. But Citizen Kane is actually responsible for so many breakthroughs in filmmaking, so many advancements in visuals, and sound, and set design, everything. There's a reason people constantly insist that it's the greatest film of all time, and we'll get to that later. But first things first, if you've never seen it, and if you're at a certain age, that's a distinct possibility, what's it all about? The film opens with an aging Charles Foster Kane saying Rosebud and dying. We then see a newsreel that punctuates everything important that ever happened in his life, basically spoiling virtually all the big plot points for the next 2 hours. It seems strange, and it is, but the point of all of this is to illustrate that a highlight reel can't really tell you the story of a man. It's the details, it's the private moments that make up his life.
Mr. Kane was a man who got everything he wanted and then lost it. Maybe Rosebud was something he couldn't get or something he lost.
A reporter goes from person to person, trying to talk to people who knew Kane, either his ex-wives or business partners, friends, people like that, trying to discover what the old man meant by Rosebud, and anything else he can learn. Kane was born into poverty, but after a gold mine was discovered on his mother's property, his mother sent him away to live with a banker named Thatcher, so that he can be properly educated and have a better life. The overwhelming trait of Charles Foster Kane is that he wanted to be loved. He wanted to be loved by everyone, so he bought his way into love. He made himself into a larger-than-life figure, so people loved him, but he didn't give that love back. He didn't respect people enough to give it back. One of the most famous aspects of the film is the popular belief that the character of Kane was based around William Randolph Hearst, which is both true and misleading. Stories about Hearst's life did absolutely influence Citizen Kane, but the writers also used bits and pieces from the lives of other people. Journalists and newspaper magnates like Joseph Pulitzer, William Harmsworth, Herbert Swope, and a lot more. Plus, a lot of it is complete fiction, so much of it is just invented from whole cloth. In fact, it does the film a disservice to say it's just a veiled biopic of Hearst. There's so much more to it than that. Citizen Kane also has noticeable anti-fascist themes. The newsreel shows Kane with Adolf Hitler while telling the public that there will be no war in Europe. Citizen Kane was released during World War II, but it was before America's intervention. Going to war versus isolationism was a hot topic at the time. Charles Foster Kane, isolating himself in his big mansion estate called Xanadu, is the personification of this. That's isolationism.
You can take my word for it. There'll be no war.
The film also warns against the corporatization of American government. Kane, holding no background in politics, runs for governor. His cronies talk about him being president one day. This isn't based on any keen knowledge of politics or anything like that. He's just rich and charismatic. And apparently, that's all it takes to be leader of the free world, at least to his cronies. Some of Citizen Kane's technological achievements and advances in the art of filmmaking might seem commonplace by today's standards, but it's important to understand the time in which Citizen Kane was made. One of the film's most significant contributions to the art of film is through its cinematography, notably through a technique known as deep focus or pan focus. This means having everything in frame all at once. Take this scene. With the right lenses and proper lighting and framing, everything from the hat up close to the camera, to the people, to the young Charlie Kane in the far background in the window is completely in focus. Citizen Kane used a lot of low-angle shots facing upward, showing the ceilings in the background. Now you might be thinking, ooh, ceilings, who cares? But you have to remember that sets at the time didn't usually have ceilings, because that's where the boom microphones were. But in Citizen Kane, rooms had ceilings, and the microphones were actually hidden in the fabric. Okay, if ceilings aren't impressive enough, how about optical illusions? When Kane walks into the background of this shot, only then do we discover that the windows are huge, and their lower sills are more than 6 feet above the floor. We see this again in a fireplace scene. It looks average-sized until someone is standing right next to it. Suddenly, it's massive. Kane wanted the biggest and best for Xanadu. Speaking of Xanadu, this is actually a matte painting. There is no mansion big enough to be the real-life Xanadu. Lights were lit behind it to show Kane's bedroom. So how was the most iconic scene in the film shot? This isn't a real crowd. It's one of the greatest examples of early miniatures used in film, with flashing lights to suggest movement. The use of shadow is gorgeous. In this scene, men are talking about the mystery of Charles Foster Kane, and what Rosebud really meant. This mystery is described in visuals, casting everyone in shadow. Later on in this next scene, a reporter finds records that might prove useful. Everything in the room is black, except for a heavenly light shining on it, showing the significance of this lost truth. See, Citizen Kane is revered for a lot of reasons. The film is the bedrock of a lot of film techniques. New cinematography. Nowadays we can do almost anything in film thanks to computers. The limitations are gone, and that's great, but that has also led to a vulgar overuse. This will not sound exciting, but it's important. Let's talk about sound mixing. Because Wells' background was in radio, he was actually the perfect man to change the way we think about sound in film. He used a technique from radio called overlapping dialogue. The scene in which characters sing a song about Charlie Kane had to mix several soundtracks together, which was uncommon at the time.
Good evening, Mr. Kane. There is a man.
There is a man.
A certain man.
A certain man.
And for the poor, you may be sure that he'll do all he can.
Citizen Kane is told in non-linear narrative, stories that are out of chronological order. Each small vignette about his life, each flashback, tells us just a little bit more about the man, about his fall from grace, about who he used to be, about who he wanted to be, and who he ultimately became. It's a jigsaw puzzle of a man's life, told by the people who knew him best, and who have all the pieces. Now, non-linear narrative was not invented by Citizen Kane. Intolerance is a 1916 silent film that intercuts 4 parallel stories that take place over the course of centuries, but they don't exactly follow the life of one man. Anyway, Citizen Kane didn't exactly invent the structure, but it did help perfect it, not to mention popularize it for future generations. Non-chronological storytelling focused on one man going back and forth through time can become structurally confused if not handled correctly. In short, the source of flashbacks in Citizen Kane, someone who knew him well in the past, is narratively tied to whatever the flashback is about. And if that sounds like it should be obvious, somehow a lot of films get that wrong. Film is like any art or craft. How high it gets is owed to its foundation. Citizen Kane is part of that foundation. The story of someone's life told with a framing device using a series of flashbacks, and those flashbacks fit narratively and thematically into one portion of his life, and it's not always in chronological order. That's Slumdog Millionaire, a movie that actually won Best Picture at the Oscars, unlike Citizen Kane, which was outdone by How Green Was My Valley. Now, with all of that said, and all the relevant information out there, we have to ask that question that people have been asking for a long time. Why is Citizen Kane often considered the greatest film of all time? To answer that, we can actually look at a modern film, Whiplash. In the film, there's this scene where the protagonist is telling his family and friends about his music competitions. Someone asks how anyone can judge music because it's subjective, to which our protagonist says that it's not. That is only kind of true. Music is art, and art by definition is subjective, but not all art competitions are. Music and dance competitions, as examples, need to have set rules and an understanding among judges on what is being rated. We can't judge a music competition on which song is the prettiest or something. Especially since music competitions in Whiplash are using old standards, not original pieces. So these knockdown, drag-out music face-offs are actually judged on technical ability and observable traits like timing and how well the musicians pull off a difficult piece without making mistakes or hitting the wrong notes. Technique. And so it goes when highfalutin film groups like the Cabal at the AFI or those Sight and Sound Illuminati decide what is the best picture of all time. It's about technique, it's about technicalities and things like that. It can't just be judged on personal favorites, or even the emotional resonance that art is designed to create. Otherwise, someone would just say, Krull is my favorite movie, so it's the greatest film of all time. And then we'd have this modern re-examination of Krull and what Krull really means to society. Instead, the films, like the competitions in Whiplash, must be judged on technical ability, form, and maybe most importantly, the historical significance of the film, which really can only be seen years later. observable things about how this film has influenced other films and how it changed how we do things in the film industry. Data that can be seen, not necessarily the effects of the individual human heart.
Solly, when you're through with that, I'd like to have it back. I'd like to keep that particular piece of paper myself. I have a hunch it might turn out to be something pretty important.
Citizen Kane does have strong emotional value. It absolutely does. That last scene, it's heartbreaking. But Citizen Kane isn't often considered the greatest film of all time for its emotion or even its non-traditional story. The narrative is important, but it's more about how it changed film. How do you measure the human heart? That's something that's hard to answer, but technique and observable impact on the industry, those things can be judged by a panel of experts. That's not to say that the people at Sight and Sound are without error, and that their determination must be followed in unified march by every film critic and every film lover alike. It actually recently decided that Vertigo is the best film of all time, and not Citizen Kane. And it's not because they somehow unearthed hidden frames inside Alfred Hitchcock's film, and now it's marginally better than it was in the past. It's just that its importance has been reevaluated as we see its influence more and more. That, and having different people look at it, certainly changes things as well. But does Citizen Kane make sense as the greatest film ever on its technicalities? Probably. The visuals are stunning, and the craft in which they are achieved is very impressive, especially considering the technological limitations of the time. Plus, its influence is just undeniable. Some might say that Citizen Kane doesn't say anything new, even for the 1940s. Mistreatment of others is bad. We know that. Falling from grace is not a new story. It's biblical. But even if the tale is constantly recycled, it doesn't cheapen it or make it less important. We can sit here and say, yeah, Citizen Kane, I know not to lose my values and be a jerk to other people, but we still do. We still absolutely do, all the time. Movies with the same messages will stop being made once we, as a species, get the message. But more than that, Citizen Kane as a historical artifact is not just about what a human being can achieve. It's about what film can achieve. Thanks for watching.